Rain hadn't stopped for 3 days when Caleb Rourke rode back into a town that had already buried him. The mud pulled at his horse like it remembered the weight of his leaving and the promise he never kept. At the edge of the street stood Eliza Whitmore, dressed dark with stormwater, eyes steady in a way that hurt worse than anger. "You promised you'd come back," she said, quiet, certain. Caleb didn't answer, couldn't, because the truth sat heavy in his chest. He had come back. Just not in time to stop what waiting had done to her or what it had turned him into. Before we ride deeper into this tale, subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss another journey through the dust, danger, and legends of the Wild West. Now, back to the trail. Rain pressed low over the town, steady and unkind, turning the street into a slow river of mud that swallowed hoofprints before they could settle. Caleb Rourke rode through it without urging his horse, shoulders squared beneath a worn coat that clung heavy with water, his clean-shaven face set in a stillness that had learned to hide more than it revealed. No one greeted him. No one called his name. But doors shifted open just enough, and faces appeared in shadows, older now, sharper, carrying the quiet knowledge of a man who had been gone too long to belong to the living. They had buried him once, not with dirt, but with certainty. A hammer stilled mid-swing near the far porch. A woman drawing water paused with the bucket half-raised. Even the boys who ran wild through the street slowed without knowing why, their laughter thinning into something uncertain as they watched him pass. Caleb felt it all without turning his head. Recognition without welcome, memory without forgiveness. The town hadn't forgotten him, it had decided what he was. The rain tapped harder against wood and tin, filling the silence he would not break, because there were too many things that could not be said standing in the open like this. Too many years pressed between each breath. Then his horse slowed on its own, not from the mud, not from the cold, from her. Eliza Whitmore stood at the edge of the street where the boards met the dirt, her dress darkened by rain, strands of her hair clinging to her face but never hiding it. She hadn't moved since he entered the town, hadn't stepped forward, hadn't turned away. She stood the way something rooted stands, not waiting, not chasing, simply there. Caleb stopped a few paces short. For a moment the rain seemed louder than anything else, louder than the shifting doors, louder than the breath in his chest that refused to settle. Her eyes found his without hesitation, not soft, not broken, steady. "You promised you'd come back." The words didn't rise. They didn't fall. They simply existed between them, as certain as the ground beneath their feet. No anger sharpened them, no plea weakened them, just truth laid bare in a way that left no room to step around. Caleb opened his mouth, then closed it again, because anything he said would come too late. He could feel the weight of every mile that had kept him from this moment pressing into his ribs. Feel the years he could not return stacking behind his silence like something permanent. His hands stayed still on the reins, though the leather creaked under the strain he didn't let show. Eliza took one step closer, boots sinking slightly into the mud, but her gaze never shifting. "You said you would." Another pause, not for effect, not for hesitation, for something final. The town watched, quiet, measuring. Caleb let out a slow breath that carried more than exhaustion. There were words he had carried across deserts, through nights that never ended, through choices that had carved him into something harder than the man who left. But here, now, none of them felt like they belonged. So he said nothing, and somehow that said everything. Because standing there in the rain, with the town holding its breath and Eliza Whitmore refusing to look away, the truth was already clear. He had come back, just not when she needed him to. Caleb remained in the street a moment longer, rain slipping from the brim of his hat, and tracing down the hard lines of his face, while the silence around him deepened into something almost ceremonial. It was the kind of silence people kept when a grave had opened and the dead had chosen, for reasons no one understood, to step back through. Eliza stood before him without moving, and in the set of her mouth he could see the years more plainly than in any weathered board or changed storefront. Time had touched the town. It had widened porches, bent roofs, thinned men at the temples, thickened women at the waist, taken children into adolescence and boys into labor. But time had touched Eliza differently. It had not made her smaller, it had made her still. That more than anything unsettled him, because once she had laughed easily, and when she walked there had always been a sense of forward motion to her, as though even hardship could not persuade her to stop believing there was something on the other side of it worth reaching. Now she stood like a woman who had learned the danger of waiting in one place too long and had chosen to do it anyway. He looked at her and memory rose, not gentle, not welcome, but sharp as cold iron. He saw a dry season evening years before, when the fields beyond town had yellowed under late light, and the creek had narrowed to a glittering line between stones. He had stood beside a split-rail fence with his hands raw from work, and Eliza had come carrying a basket of mended shirts for her father, stopping when she saw him as though she had known exactly where to find him. There had been dust on her hem then, sunlight in her hair, no bitterness in her eyes. They had not needed many words in those days. Their understanding had grown in the spaces between them, shared labor, borrowed glances, long walks after Sunday meeting when the others fell behind on purpose or by instinct, sensing something forming too quiet to name without ruining it. Caleb had been little more than a hired hand with a strong back and not enough future to offer anyone. And Eliza had been the daughter of a man whose farm gave more worry than profit. Yet with her, scarcity had felt temporary. They had learned each other through small things, the way she could knead bread while listening to bad news and never spill a measure of flour, the way he always fixed a broken latch before sitting to supper, as though disorder in a house pricked him like a burr under skin, the way she spoke softly to frightened animals and directly to frightened people, the way he looked away when praised but not when needed. That was how it had started, not with a declaration. Not with a grand claim, with nearness, with repetition, with the slow certainty that two lonely people, seeing each other clearly, had begun to imagine a life that might hold if they held to it. Then had come the day he left. Even now he could feel the heat of it. The air had stood heavy over the road, and the horses tied near the mercantile had stamped at flies. Word had spread quickly that there was money to be made driving cattle south with a hard outfit headed across rough country. Enough money, maybe, for a piece of land, a roof that didn't leak, a beginning no one could take away by one bad winter or a poor harvest. Caleb had spoken of it like a man who feared hope might vanish if he said too much. Eliza had listened with her hands clasped before her apron, watching him with those clear eyes that always seemed to ask not whether he meant what he said, but whether he understood what it would cost to mean it. One season, he had told her, maybe less if the trail stays clean. He had not touched her then, not with all of town near enough to see, but he had leaned close enough for the promise to belong only to her. I'll come back with enough to do it right. She had not cried. She had not begged him to stay. That would not have been like her. She had simply searched his face, as if measuring the distance between the man before her and the life he was asking her to trust. Then she had nodded once. I know you will. It was that faith, more than the words themselves, that had followed him longest. Not because he deserved it, because he had lived inside it. He remembered riding out while the town shrank behind him and looking back only once. Eliza had still been there near the road, one hand lifted against the sun, small but unmistakable, and in that instant his promise had felt less like speech than law. He would return. He would not be one of those men swallowed by distance, by greed, by violence, by the strange forgetting that took hold of some drifters until every place they'd left behind became too painful to claim. He would return. The memory broke against the present like a wave against rock. In the rain, before her now, he felt not only the shape of that younger certainty, but the ruin of it. The town remembered too. He could see it in the faces turned toward them from porches and windows. They remembered the first weeks after he left, when Eliza had gone about her chores with a light in her step she could not fully hide, as if the waiting itself contained joy because it pointed toward something promised. They remembered how she had taken to pausing by the road in the evenings, not in a way meant to be noticed, but in a way impossible not to notice once it repeated often enough. She would stand near the bend where riders first came into view, one hand resting on the fence, gaze turned outward. At first, the sight had seemed ordinary. People waited for wagons, for kin, for hired men, for medicine, for news, but weeks passed, then months. Other drovers returned from other routes. Other men rode back to other women. Caleb did not. Eliza kept waiting. In winter she wrapped a shawl close and stood anyway. In spring mud she lifted her skirt above the road and looked down it anyway. There had been pity at first, then explanations offered in low voices, trail trouble, fever, stolen herd, flooded crossing. Men disappear for reasons that do not mean betrayal, but explanations, repeated too often, begin to sound like excuses, and excuses sour quickly in small towns. By the second year the pity had changed shape. Women at the pump would glance toward Eliza's place and lower their voices, though not enough. Men in the feed store would shake their heads like they understood all the ways a young woman could waste her life on a promise made by a cowboy with more shoulders than prospects. Some said Caleb must be dead. Others said worse, that he had found easier company elsewhere, that promises were cheap on hot afternoons, that a man can mean a thing and still fail it once the world offers him another road. Eliza heard enough to know the drift of it, yet she did not defend him. She did not accuse him either. She simply kept her own counsel and kept standing at the road longer than anyone thought wise. Caleb knew none of this in order, not as town gossip had carried it. He knew it now by the evidence before him, and by the way old memories returned and reshaped themselves under her gaze. He could picture, with sudden cruel clarity, the likely sequence of her days after he vanished from the future he had asked her to trust. The first missed month. The first season gone. The first Christmas with no letter and no hoofbeats in the yard. Her father sickening not long after, because hardship rarely arrives alone. Bills accumulating, seed running thin, neighbors helping at first, then helping with opinions attached. A woman's waiting, when it outlasts what others can respect, becomes a public thing. People begin to act as though the wound belongs to them because they have watched it long enough. Eliza had not been spared that theft. He saw it in the quiet lift of her chin, the kind a person develops after being spoken over too many times. "You should get out of the rain," a voice called from somewhere near the porch of the general store, too cautious to sound kind. Caleb turned slightly. Old Martin Cole stood there with one hand braced against a post, face creased deeper than Caleb remembered. "Your horse is near spent." Caleb gave a small nod, but his eyes returned to Eliza. If she wanted him gone from the street, she did not say it. If she wanted him to stay and answer for himself where all could witness it, She did not say that either. She looked at him the way people look at damaged things washed ashore, something once hoped for, now altered enough to make hope dangerous. "Where will you go?" she asked at last, not softening, not granting, asking as one adult asks another whose return has created a burden no one requested. Caleb's fingers tightened on the reins. He could have named no place in town that still belonged to him. The room above the blacksmith shop where he had slept as a young hand would be long taken. The bunkhouse by Harlan's pasture might as well have burned, for all the claim he had left there. He had come back with no expectation of welcome, but in that question he heard the full measure of his estrangement. Home was not a road one simply followed backward. "Livery first," he said. His voice sounded rough from disuse or from all the things packed behind it. "Then I'll see." Her gaze dropped, not to his face, but to the hand holding the reins. The knuckles were ridged with old scars, one finger bent wrong at the middle joint. Rain slicked the skin, making the pale marks stand out starkly. Then her eyes moved lower, to the way he sat the saddle. Too straight through the spine, too controlled through the shoulders, as though any careless shift would wake pain he had taught himself to keep quiet. Caleb knew what she was seeing because he felt it every moment. The shoulder that had once turned a full circle now caught with a dry, deep pull. The left side of his ribs still burned in cold weather where an old wound had healed ugly. There was a notch missing high along his ear, hidden mostly by damp hair. His body told pieces of the story his mouth refused to form, not enough to excuse, enough to prove absence had not been ease. "You look like a man who got lost," Eliza said. The words were plain, but something inside them trembled once and was gone. Caleb held her eyes. "Maybe I was." She gave the smallest shake of her head. "Get lost on the trail. You were gone years." That struck where no bullet ever had. He had no answer that did not open doors he was not yet ready to open in the center of a watching town, because some truths were still moving toward them. Some dangers, he suspected, had not stayed buried simply because he had come farther than the men who once hunted him. He had ridden into town with the old habit of watching doorways and ridge lines, of counting strangers without seeming to count them. Already he had marked a horse near the far hitching rail he did not recognize, and two saddles under oilcloth outside the boarding house built for travel, not residence. Maybe they belonged to salesmen, maybe to no one tied to him. Still, the old cold instinct had stirred. He could not tell Eliza that in the rain, he could not tell her enough. And silence, he knew, was a cruelty she had already been forced to live beside. Yet he had nothing ready but silence. She seemed to read that too. For a long breath they remained like that, with rain working the edges of them and the town listening. Then Eliza stepped back first, not in surrender, in conclusion. "The livery still stands," she said. "Mr. Boone runs it now. His son was 12 when you left. He's got children of his own." The words were simple information, but the years inside them landed hard. Caleb dipped his head once. She turned before he could say her name. It rose in him and stopped there. Eliza crossed the street through mud that clung at her boots, and as she moved, the town seemed to exhale. Doors opened a little wider. A wagon rattled somewhere farther down. Life resumed, but not truly, not yet. Caleb watched her until she reached the narrow building near the old Cooper's lot, a place that had once been little more than a shed for tools and feed. It was not that now. A painted board hung above the door, rain dark but legible, Whitmore sewing and mending. He stared at it as if the letters required decoding. Through the front window he could see a lamp burning, and beyond it, shelves lined with folded cloth, thread, patterns pinned careful and straight. Not a grand life, not an easy one, but built. made by hands that had not waited idle. Something tightened in his chest that had nothing to do with scars. So this was what she had done while the town reduced her to a woman standing by a road. She had made herself useful where use could not be denied. She had turned skill into trade, persistence into shelter. The knowledge brought no relief, only a more exact pain, because it meant she had survived him, because it meant she had needed to. At the livery, Boone himself came out into the rain, broad through the middle now, beard gone silver in patches. He squinted once, then twice, before recognition settled. "Lord above," he muttered, "it is you." Caleb slid stiffly from the saddle, landing a little harder than he meant to. Boone's eyes flicked over him, taking stock with the efficient discretion of men who have seen enough damage not to ask about each mark. "Horse can have a stall," Boone said. "You can have the loft if you don't mind hay and mice." Caleb swallowed the first raw gratitude that came. "I don't mind." Boone took the reins, then hesitated. "Folks said all sorts of things. I imagine they did." Boone studied him another second, then gave a short nod. "Well, you're here now." Caleb almost laughed at the brutality of that simplicity. Here now, as though arrival settled anything, as though returning and coming back meant the same thing. He unsaddled with his good hand doing more than the other, keeping his movements economical so the catch in his shoulder did not show too plainly. But Boone saw. Older men who work with animals notice where pain lives. "Got yourself carved up some," he said. Caleb looped the bridle over a peg. Trail had opinions. Boone snorted once at that, not amused exactly, but willing to let a poor joke stand in for the questions he would not ask. When the horse was rubbed down and fed, Caleb climbed to the loft with his bedroll and sat on a crate beneath the slanted roof while rain drummed overhead. Through the gaps in the boards he could see a narrow slice of street, and beyond it, the glow from Eliza's shop window. He sat there until dark took the shapes from things and left only light and memory. In the hours that followed, pieces of what he had missed returned not in orderly sequence, but in fragments, each one worse for being imagined. Eliza opening the shop alone on a bitter morning, hands red from cold before the stove caught. Eliza carrying bolts of cloth from the freight wagon because no one had come to help, and asking no one twice. Eliza at church, with the women making room for her out of courtesy, while their eyes exchanged judgments over bowed heads. Eliza walking home past men who tipped their hats with that careful kindness reserved for women the world had disappointed publicly. Eliza hearing some new bride laugh about how foolish it was to wait on a drifter's word and continuing past as though the words belonged to weather. He had not seen these things, yet he knew enough of towns, of women, of the economies of pity and shame, to know he was not inventing them whole. And the worst of it was this: somewhere inside all her proving, all her labor, all her refusal to collapse under the watching eyes of others, there had remained a part of her still raw enough to stand in the rain and say, "You promised." Not because she was weak, because she had remembered exactly who he had been when he made that vow. Caleb leaned forward, elbows on knees, and pressed his hands together until the old injuries flared. He had thought on the long ride in that hardship might explain him when words failed, that if Eliza saw what was left of his body, she might at least understand there had been no easy faithlessness in his absence. But understanding was not forgiveness. Pain did not cancel pain. A broken man arriving late is still late. Outside, the rain thinned for the first time in days, tapering against the roof in softer strokes. Across the street, the lamp in Eliza's shop dimmed, then vanished. The darkness that followed felt larger than it should have. Caleb sat with it, hearing in the quiet all the roads between the promise he had made and the life she had built without him. Somewhere below, a horse shifted in straw. Somewhere in town, a door shut. Somewhere not far off, he imagined Eliza laying out cloth for the morning's work, setting her accounts in order, keeping her world aligned by hand because trust in anything beyond the reach of her own effort had once cost too much. He closed his eyes and saw her as she had been at the fence, then as she had been in the street, then not as either, but as the woman the years between had forged without his witness. And for the first time since turning his horse toward the town, Caleb allowed himself the full, unsheltered truth. He had not returned to reclaim a life. He had returned to face what his failing had made of hers. Morning came grey and thin, with the rain reduced to a mist that clung to the town like breath on glass. Caleb had not slept much. Men who spend too many years waking at the slightest shift in the dark do not relearn rest in a single night, not even under a decent roof, not even with walls between them and the weather. He had lain on the hayloft boards listening to horses stamp below and thinking of the light going out in Eliza's window. By dawn he was already awake, seated with his back against a post, hat low, the old habits of watchfulness settling over him before his boots touched the floor. The town moved slower after 3 days of rain. Wagon wheels dragged. Porch brooms pushed mud instead of dust. The smell of wet timber and turned earth hung everywhere. Caleb crossed the street with his coat buttoned high, every step reminding him of the miles still lodged in bone. He told himself he only meant to see the town in daylight, to understand what had changed and what hadn't. But when his path curved naturally toward Whitmore sewing and mending, he let it. Eliza was already outside, prying open the shutters with a determined lift of her shoulder. The sign above her door still glistened from the storm. A crate of folded cloth sat near her boots, half covered with canvas. She did not look surprised to find him there. That somehow struck deeper than if she had. "You're up early," she said. "So are you." "I own a shop. The shop doesn't open itself." He nodded once, standing a little back, as though the distance between them might spare them both some strain. Up close in the morning light, he could see how the years had worked at her more quietly than the rain allowed yesterday. There were faint lines at the corners of her eyes, not from bitterness exactly, but from holding herself together through weather she never invited. She looked tired in a way strong people do, never enough to slow, only enough to deepen them. She bent to lift the crate. Caleb stepped forward on instinct. "I can get that," he said. Eliza kept her hands on it. "I've been getting it." The words were not cruel. That made them worse. Caleb let go before he had truly taken hold. She carried the crate inside and set it on the counter with controlled precision. Through the open door, he saw the room more clearly than he had in the rain. Neat shelves, baskets of thread, fabric laid in careful stacks, an iron stove near the wall, a work table worn smooth by use. It was modest, but nothing in it suggested surrender. Every inch had been claimed by effort. "You built this," he said. "I did." Another pause, the kind that gathers all the things neither person wants to say first. A wagon clattered past. 2 boys ran by in boots still damp from the storm. Somewhere down the street a dog barked and was hushed. For a few breaths, ordinary town sounds covered the strain between them. Then Caleb felt it. Not a sound, not a certainty, more like the old instinct tightening at the base of his neck. He turned before he meant to and looked toward the western end of town where the road descended between cottonwoods and opened onto the main street. 3 riders, 2 straight-backed for farmers, 2 watchful for drifters. Their horses were trail-worn but well-kept, saddles cinched for distance, coats dark with old rain and road grime. They did not ride like men looking for breakfast or a room. They rode like men measuring a place before deciding how much of it they might need to break. Caleb went still. Eliza saw the change before she saw the riders. "What is it?" He didn't answer at once, because recognition had already struck, cold and exact. The man in front had a narrow face and a black hat brim cut low over one eye. Caleb had seen that face by firelight, by moonlight, once through the red blur of blood and dust. Mercer Vane, not the worst man Caleb had known. Worse in some ways, the kind who smiled when other men raised their voices, the kind who let silence do half his threatening for him. He'd been lieutenant to Sealer's cutter, the man Caleb had ridden with before everything broke, before the trail job became something else entirely. The two behind him Caleb didn't know by name, but he knew the type. Men bought with loyalty to fear, not cause. Men who stayed close to violence because it paid better than labor and required less of the soul. Eliza followed his gaze. "You know them." It was not a question. Caleb's jaw tightened. "Inside." Her eyes narrowed. "This is my shop." "Inside, Eliza." That did it. She stepped toward him, not away. "You don't get to come back and start giving orders." The riders were closer now, near enough that the horses' hooves hit the softened street with a wet, rhythmic weight. Townsfolk had begun to notice. Boone paused outside the livery. A woman at the mercantile stopped mid-conversation. One of the church elders looked up from adjusting a wagon tarp and held there too long to be casual. Caleb lowered his voice. "Please." Something in the word made her stop, not because it was persuasive, because it was frayed. She glanced once more at the riders, then at Caleb's face, and whatever she saw there made her turn and step into the doorway rather than remain fully exposed in the street. Mercer Vane brought his horse to a slow halt near the well. He took in the storefronts, the watching townspeople, the livery, the church steeple beyond. Then his gaze settled on Caleb with the kind of patience men reserve for prey they no longer fear losing. "Well now," Mercer said softly, almost pleasantly, "would you look at that?" No one answered him. Mercer removed his gloves finger by finger. "Been a long road, Rourke." Caleb stood where he was, boots planted in the mud, one hand loose at his side, not near his gun, not yet. He had learned long ago that the most dangerous moment in a town was not when steel cleared leather. It was before, when everyone could still pretend nothing had happened. "You should have kept riding," Caleb said. Mercer gave a thin smile. "That sounds ungrateful, considering how much ground we covered to find you." A murmur passed through the street. People might not know the history, but they knew enough to hear threat when it arrived wearing calm. Boone stepped a little farther from the livery. "You men looking for feed or trouble?" Mercer turned his head just enough to acknowledge him. "Neither. If the town stays sensible, we are here for one man." That unsettled the street more than if he'd said all of them. Trouble for everyone can be faced together. Trouble aimed at one man invites calculation. Men begin to decide how close they can stand without being counted. Caleb felt it. The town felt it. Eliza felt it from the doorway behind him. Mercer's gaze flicked toward the shop. "Interesting place you came to ground." Caleb's voice dropped. "Leave this town." "I plan to, soon as I settle what's owed." "What's owed died with Cutter." At that the smile thinned even more. One of the men behind Mercer shifted in his saddle. "Careful," Mercer said. "Some folks still have respect for the dead." Caleb held his stare. Not that one. The name moved through him like old poison. Sealer's cutter, trail boss, gunman, thief in a gentleman's coat when he cared to wear one. Caleb had ridden with him once because work was work, and the West taught young men to judge a job by pay before principle. But principle always arrives eventually, usually with blood on it. Mercer leaned slightly forward on the saddle horn. We can do this out in the open or somewhere less public. Makes no matter to me. But I didn't come all this way to watch you hide behind a dressmaker's door. Before Caleb could answer, Eliza stepped out onto the threshold. The motion was small, the effect was not. Then stop looking at my door, she said. Mercer turned, studied her, and gave the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. Ma'am. Caleb moved half a step, enough to place himself between them without making a show of it. Mercer noticed. Of course he did. Ah, he said, so that part was true. Eliza's gaze shifted from Mercer to Caleb and back again. What part? Mercer tipped his hat back a fraction. That he had someplace he'd crawl home to once he ran out of dark. Mercer, Caleb said, and the name landed like a warning, but Mercer had already seen the opening. You didn't tell her. Caleb's silence answered too much. Mercer let the quiet work. That's a shame. I rode in half expecting I'd find a widow or a grave. Didn't think I'd find a woman still standing where he left her. Eliza went rigid. The town heard every word. Caleb stepped forward, voice low and sharp. You say one more thing to her. What? Mercer asked gently. You'll kill me in front of these good people. Might want to consider how that ends for them. That was the first true strike, and Mercer knew it. The men behind him sat easy, but too easy. Ready? Caleb understood then with full certainty. This was no chance pursuit, no last grudge loosely carried. Mercer had not come simply to find him. He had come to find him here. To place danger in the one spot Caleb could neither ignore nor outrun. Boone must have sensed it too, because he called toward the sheriff's office, though the sheriff himself had not yet emerged. Might be time somebody stepped out. The office door stayed shut. Of course it did. A town sheriff measures danger the way merchants measure debt. 3 armed strangers with calm voices and a single declared target often look, from a distance, like a dispute best allowed to settle itself. Mercer glanced once at the closed office, amused. Reasonable town. Caleb looked at him and saw not only the man before him, but the trail camp years ago, lantern light on faces, cutter's ledger spread open on a crate, numbers that didn't match the cattle they were supposed to drive, routes that curved too close to places no honest herd had business near. He remembered the first suspicion, the second, then the proof. Cutter hadn't been moving cattle alone. He'd been transporting something else beneath the noise of trail work, money taken off desperate miners, papers stripped from dead landowners, deeds rewritten under threat, bribes carried between men too polished to dirty their hands directly. Caleb had found out too much. Worse, he'd objected too late and too loudly. That had been where the breaking started. Mercer dismounted at last, boots sinking into the wet street. His 2 men stayed mounted, watching all angles. We should talk, Mercer said. We already are. Not like this. Caleb knew what he meant. Not in front of witnesses. Not where the first lie could be challenged by 10 sets of ears. Not where Eliza might hear enough to ask the questions Caleb had spent years dreading. He also knew refusal would not end anything. It would only move the danger closer to homes and children and storefront glass. Where? Caleb asked. Mercer inclined his head toward the old feed shed near the edge of town, half empty this season and set back from the street. There. Eliza spoke before Caleb could. No. Mercer looked entertained. Caleb did not turn. Eliza, he said quietly. No. She came down from the threshold fully now, rain-damp light catching on the tension in her face. You don't disappear for years, come back with ghosts behind you, and then walk off with them like I'm supposed to stand here and guess what kind of storm just rode into my life. Mercer's expression sharpened with interest. He was learning as much from this as he'd hoped. Caleb kept his eyes on Mercer. This isn't your fight. She laughed once, without warmth. That would be easier to believe if they hadn't stopped in front of my door. There it was, plain, true, unavoidable. Mercer spread his hands slightly. I'd be happy to wait while you two sort out the romance of it. Caleb's stare could have cut wood. You talk too much for a man who used to live by ambush. And you lived too long for a man who should have died twice. That line hung between them. Eliza heard it. Caleb knew she did because the silence behind him changed shape. Twice. He closed his eyes for the smallest fraction of a second. Too late. Eliza's voice came quieter now, but more dangerous for it. What does he mean? Mercer looked delighted. He really told you nothing. Caleb turned then because he had to. Eliza stood 3 paces away, one hand clenched at her side so hard the knuckles had gone pale. Her eyes searched his face with something worse than anger now. Recognition. The kind that forms when old grief suddenly finds a new outline. What does he mean? She asked again. Caleb should have lied. Should have said Mercer was baiting her, that trail men say anything to start a fracture and step through it. But the years had already been built on too much silence. One more lie, especially now, would rot the ground under whatever was left. He means, Caleb said carefully, I came back once before. Nothing in the street moved. Mercer let out a long breath through his nose, pleased as a man at cards who has watched another lay down the wrong hand. Eliza stared at Caleb as if the world had tilted and she was refusing to fall with it. What? His throat felt scraped raw. I came back. The words sounded small against what they held. When? He looked at the mud rather than her face. The second autumn after I left. Her breath caught, not loudly, but enough. The town around them had become a ring of listening. Eliza took one slow step toward him. You came back. She said it as though testing whether the sentence itself could exist without breaking. You came back, and you did not come to me. Caleb said nothing. That was answer enough. For a moment he thought she might strike him. There was no weakness in her posture now, no trembling appeal, only the kind of hurt that has passed clean through sorrow and come out the other side as clarity. You saw me waiting, she said. He swallowed once. Yes. The word nearly dropped him where he stood. Mercer watched like a man warming his hands over borrowed flame. Eliza's voice went thin with control. You saw me, and you left. Caleb finally looked at her. I was hurt, bad, and they were behind me. So you left? Yes. Without a word. Yes. The honesty of it seemed to stagger her more than excuse would have. Caleb forced breath into his chest. I came in after dark. I made it as far as the rise above town. I could see the church roof, Boone's old livery. Your father's place. His voice roughened on the memory. I saw your lamp. Eliza stood utterly still. I meant to come down, he said. I meant to, but I had Mercer's men 2 days behind me, maybe less, and Cutter still alive then, and if they'd seen where I stopped, if they'd seen who I rode toward, they would have marked this town, marked you. I'd already seen what happened to places they thought were useful. Mercer's mouth flattened at Cutter's name, but he did not interrupt. Caleb kept going because stopping now would be cowardice dressed as restraint. There'd been a ranch south of Red Hollow, family of 5. Cutter thought the owner hid records from him. We passed through after. House burned, barn half standing, nothing left worth naming. I knew what those men did when cornered. I knew what they did when they wanted leverage. So I turned my horse before dawn and rode out. Eliza listened without blinking. I left, he said, each word heavier than the last, because if I came to you, they'd follow the look on my face and use it. They'd use this town. They'd use your father. They'd use any soul who opened a door for me. The truth settled into the street not like absolution, but like weather. Real, cold, unasked for. Boone lowered his eyes. Someone near the mercantile crossed themselves without seeming to know it. Eliza stood in the center of it all, and Caleb knew from the way her mouth trembled once before setting again that the revelation had struck exactly where he feared it would, not at her anger, but beneath it. When my father died, she said quietly, did you know? Caleb's chest tightened. No. When people said you were dead, did you know? No. When they laughed at me for waiting, when they said I'd built my life around a man too faithless or too foolish to return, did you know any of that? His silence lasted one heartbeat too long. Not then. Not then, she repeated, but later. Yes. The word looked like it hurt her to hear, and you still stayed away. Mercer's men shifted in their saddles. The town remained frozen around the scene, but now the true confrontation had nothing to do with them. It had become something more private than walls could contain. Caleb stepped closer, ignoring the protest in his ribs. I stayed away because once Cutter died, others wanted what he'd buried and what I knew. I thought if I kept moving, it would end with me. You thought, Eliza said, and there was the fracture for me. He could not deny it. She nodded once slowly, as if each piece were fitting into place and making the whole more unbearable, not less. That's what you still don't understand. Mercer looked almost disappointed that he was no longer the center of the wound. Eliza's eyes never left Caleb's. You don't get to decide what I can bear. You don't get to look at me from a hill in the dark and choose my life because yours got dangerous. I was trying to keep you alive. And I was alive. Her voice rose at last, not shrill, but strong enough to carry to every porch. Do you hear me? I was alive, Caleb. I was alive while my father died, while this town watched me become a cautionary tale, while every hard season came through that door and sat at my table with me. I was alive for all of it, and you were out there somewhere telling yourself you had spared me. The truth of that cut deeper than accusation, because some part of him had indeed worn that thought like penance made noble. Better she hate a faithless man than be buried by loyal enemies. Better the wound she knew than the danger she didn't. But standing before her now, he could see the arrogance inside it. Protection, when given without choice, becomes another kind of taking. I know, he said, but the words sounded poor. No, she answered. You know what scared you, that is not the same. Mercer made a soft, appreciative sound, as if admiring a clean shot. Caleb wanted to put him in the mud and end the listening, But Mercer had become almost incidental now, a shadow at the edge of a fire he had only helped uncover. Eliza stepped back once, drawing a breath that steadied her but did not soften anything. "I believe you thought you were protecting me." Caleb lifted his eyes. "That does not make it mercy." Those 6 words stripped him more cleanly than any confession he could have made against himself. The street held them there, Caleb carrying old blood and older guilt, Eliza carrying years of abandonment suddenly recast but not erased, Mercer and his men watching with the patience of wolves near a campfire they had no need to enter yet. At last Mercer spoke again. "Touching as this is, I didn't come for philosophy." Caleb turned, slow and deliberate. Whatever had cracked open between him and Eliza would not be healed here, perhaps not anywhere, but Mercer was still standing in her town, using her pain as leverage, and that returned everything to a simpler axis. "You want me," Caleb said. "Take me outside town." Mercer considered. "Tempting, but I've learned something over the years. Men don't always go where you push. Sometimes they go where you anchor." His gaze drifted toward Eliza once more. Caleb's hand moved at last, not to his gun, but enough to make intent unmistakable. Mercer's men straightened in their saddles. Boone spoke sharply, "Not here." Mercer smiled faintly, wise. Then to Caleb, "Sundown. Feed shed beyond the north pasture. You come alone, we talk, you don't, well." He gave the town a leisurely glance. "Places like this are made of kindling." The threat landed because it didn't need shouting. Mercer remounted. His men followed. For a heartbeat, Caleb thought they might ride out entirely. Instead, they guided their horses toward the boarding house and dismounted there, claiming temporary ground like men certain they would not be refused. The town began to breathe again, but unevenly. Fear travels fast in small places, faster still when it wears no mask. Eliza looked at Caleb once more. Whatever remained between them had changed shape again. Anger split by knowledge, knowledge sharpened by anger, love buried too deep to die cleanly, and therefore condemned to complicate everything. "You should have trusted me with the truth," she said. He answered with the only honesty left. "I know." She held his gaze another second, then turned and went inside her shop, closing the door with care rather than force. That hurt too. A slam would have offered release. Care suggested something harder, that even wounded, she refused to let him make wreckage of what she had built. Caleb remained in the street while the town looked everywhere but at him. By sundown, the past that had followed him here would ask for more than words, but the greater reckoning had already begun, not between gunmen. Between 2 people who had once trusted love to carry what silence eventually destroyed. And now, with danger standing openly at the edge of town, neither of them could afford the comfort of believing the other's pain had been simpler than it was. By sundown, the town had gone quiet in the way places do when fear has moved in and chosen a chair near the door. Storefronts shuttered early. Lamps were lit low. Supper tables filled with people listening harder than eating, each household pretending the danger belonged to someone else, while feeling it lean against their walls all the same. Caleb spent the last hour of daylight in Boone's livery, with the loft ladder behind him and the old ache in his shoulder, tightening each time he reached for the saddlebag he had kept close for years. Boone watched without asking until Caleb finally drew out a packet wrapped in oilcloth, flattened from weather and time. Inside lay the thing Mercer Vane had really come for, a folded bundle of deeds, ledgers, and sign pages stained at the corners, proof of what Silas Cutter had built under the cover of trail work. Names, payments, coerced transfers of land, signatures taken from men too drunk, too threatened, or too dead to contest them. Among the papers was a ledger page marked with shipments tied to 2 ranch burnings, 1 bribed sheriff, and a judge in the territory seat who had turned stolen land into lawful ownership with the stroke of a pen. Caleb had taken the packet the night Cutter died, not for profit, not even for justice at first, but because he understood at last that men like Cutter did not merely steal cattle. They stole futures. They hollowed communities from the inside and sold the bones. Boone stared at the papers with his jaw set. Lord, Caleb rewrapped them. This is what they've chased. Boone looked toward the loft opening where the sky had darkened to slate. You should have taken that to the law years ago. Caleb gave him a tired look. Which law? Boone had no answer to that. Neither did the West. Caleb slid the packet inside his coat. Tonight he had meant to ride to the feed shed, face Mercer, and draw the danger away before it rooted deeper. But Mercer had changed the terms the moment he'd spoken in the street. This was no longer only about Caleb's body. It was about the papers, about what they could expose, and about leverage. Men who build their power on hidden cruelty fear truth more than bullets. Just then boots struck the floor below in quick succession. Boone turned. His eldest grandson, face pale, stood in the doorway struggling for breath. Mr. Boone, he looked at Caleb and swallowed. They took Miss Eliza. The world did not slow, it narrowed. Caleb was already moving before the rest came. From the shop, one stayed at the horse rail and the others went in. She fought them. Mrs. Fenley saw. They've got her at the feed shed north of the pasture. Boone cursed under his breath. Caleb went cold in a way he had not allowed himself in years. Mercer had done exactly what Caleb once feared he would. He had marked the look on Caleb's face and used it, not after some delay, not after patient plotting, immediately, a clean lesson in the cost of old silences. Boone grabbed his arm. You can't charge in blind. Caleb looked down at the hand on his sleeve. I won't. Then what? Caleb's voice came low and steady because anything else would have broken. This time I don't leave her standing alone. He saddled with speed and economy, the old role settling onto him like a coat he'd tried to bury, not the trail hand he once had been, not the drifter built out of damage and evasions. Something harder, cleaner, a man who knew exactly what evil looked like when it had room to work. Boone insisted on coming, but Caleb shook his head. If this goes wrong, town needs somebody with sense left in it. Boone started to argue, then stopped. He had seen Caleb's face. Men do not argue long with that kind of decision. Caleb rode out through the back lane, not the main street, cutting through wet fields where the grass still held rain, and the dusk made each fence post look like a waiting figure. The feed shed stood beyond the north pasture near a line of cottonwoods bent by old wind, half collapsed at one side but still standing enough for a trap. Caleb dismounted before the rise and approached on foot, keeping low along the ditch where runoff had carved the ground soft. Light leaked thinly through the slats. He heard Mercer first, calm as ever. You see, Miss Whitmore, men like Caleb mistake hiding truth for carrying it, noble on the outside, rot underneath. Eliza answered with breath still uneven from struggle but her voice intact. And men like you mistake fear for respect. Mercer chuckled. There he is in your mouth even now. Caleb moved to the rear corner and peered through a gap. Eliza sat tied to a support post, wrists bound in front, but not well enough to stop her from bloodying one of the men's cheek, if the mark on him meant anything. Mercer stood a few paces away, hat off now, hair damp at the temples. The other 2 men kept to either side with guns loose and ready. On a crate nearby sat a lantern and beside it an empty stretch of wood where Mercer clearly expected Caleb to place the packet. "You know why he really left?" Mercer asked her. Eliza's chin lifted. "I know enough, do you?" Mercer's tone sharpened by a grain. "He took Cutter's papers when Cutter died. Took everything men have spent years trying to recover, not because he was brave. Because he was finally frightened. One look at the machinery underneath the money and he ran from all of it." Eliza said nothing. Mercer leaned closer. "You're tied to a post because your cowboy developed a conscience too late." Caleb stepped from the darkness before the rage could grow reckless. "Let her go." Mercer smiled without surprise. "There you are." The men swung their guns toward him. Caleb stopped in the open, hands visible. "You wanted me, I'm here." Mercer's gaze ran over him, then toward the front opening as though measuring whether anyone else might follow. "Alone? Yes." Mercer's smile thinned. "Pity. I was beginning to think this town might have found some backbone." Caleb looked only at Eliza. Her face was pale from strain but steady, eyes bright with anger rather than fear. That sight nearly undid him more than panic would have, because she had once stood by a road helpless in her waiting. Now even bound, she looked like a person choosing where to put her strength. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "Not enough to satisfy them." Mercer laughed softly. That's what I was curious about, if you'd ask after her before the papers." Caleb reached inside his coat slowly and drew out the oilcloth packet. Mercer's men tensed. "You get this," Caleb said, "and she walks." Mercer's gaze fixed on the packet with open hunger for the first time. "Set it down." Caleb did not move. "She walks first." Still bargaining, Mercer shook his head. "You've never understood the order of things." Caleb held his ground. "I understand it better than Cutter did." That name changed the air. One of the gunmen spat to the side. Mercer's face went almost blank. Careful, Caleb took one deliberate step forward. Cutter built himself a kingdom on stolen claims, burned ranches, bought badges, and called it trade. You were his dog then, and you're his shadow now. The difference is a dog at least knows when a house isn't his. Mercer's eyes hardened. "And what are you, Rourke?" "The fool who rode with him until the fire got close enough to singe his own hide." The truth landed because Caleb had earned it. He did not flinch. "Yes." That answer startled even Mercer. Caleb kept going. "I rode with bad men because the pay was easy, and I told myself I wasn't responsible for what I didn't start." That's the lie men like Cutter live on. Everybody taking one clean piece and pretending they don't see the blood on the whole loaf. Mercer stared at him. Eliza did too. "I saw," Caleb said. "Too late, but I saw." The confession opened something in the room bigger than threat. For years Caleb had carried the story as fragments: ambush, wound, pursuit, silence. Now he spoke the ugliest part plain. He had not merely suffered evil. He had once worked beside it. That was the moral debt under everything else. Mercer recovered first. A beautiful speech. Set down the papers. Caleb crouched and placed the packet in the dirt between them. One of the gunmen stepped toward it. At the same moment, Eliza moved. She had been working her wrists against the knot all along, not enough to free herself, but enough to loosen the lantern hook by the post. She kicked the lantern hard into the man reaching for the packet. Glass shattered. Oil burst. Flame climbed dry feed sacks in a breath. The shed exploded into confusion. The nearest man shouted and stumbled back with fire on his sleeve. Caleb was already in motion. He drove into the second gunman before the shot cleared true, slamming the man against the crate hard enough to splinter it. Pain ripped through Caleb's shoulder, but he used the momentum anyway, wrenching the weapon loose and throwing it into the fire. Mercer fired once. The bullet tore through wood where Caleb's head had been a blink earlier. Smoke thickened fast, climbing the rafters. Eliza twisted free enough to drag the post rope down and spill burning hay away from herself. Caleb struck the man beneath him once, twice, then turned as Mercer came in low with the butt of his gun. The blow caught Caleb along the ribs, white-hot where old damage still lived. He staggered. Mercer hit him again and snarled, all civility burned off now. "You should have died on the ridge." Caleb drove an elbow into Mercer's throat, and both men crashed into the support beam beside Eliza. She seized the fallen gun from the dirt with bound hands and swung it like a club at the third man who had regained his feet. The stock cracked across his temple. He dropped. Mercer lunged for the packet instead of the door. Of course he did. Fire lit the greed in him clearer than daylight. Caleb saw it and understood the final shape of the man. Not loyal, not avenging, only hungry for the same machinery Cutter had worshipped. Caleb tackled him before he reached it. They went down in dirt and sparks, fists and knees and old hatred. Mercer was quicker than Caleb remembered, but Caleb was done running from pain. He took 2 blows to land one, drove forward through the screaming of his shoulder, and pinned Mercer's gun hand under his knee. Mercer grinned up at him with smoke in his teeth. "You think this changes what you were?" Caleb hit him once across the mouth. "No," again harder, "it changes what I do next." Outside, voices rose. Boone, 2 townsmen, maybe more. The fire and gunshots had brought them. Mercer heard it too and twisted savage as a trapped thing, pulling a knife from his boot. Caleb caught the wrist just before the blade found his side. They strained there, breath hot, smoke choking the air, while the knife hovered and shook. Then Eliza stepped close. Caleb saw her through the blur, hair loosened, wrist still half-bound, face streaked with soot and fury, not waiting by the road, standing in the fire. She drove the loose end of the rope around Mercer's knife wrist and yanked with all the strength years had built into her. The blade dropped. Caleb slammed Mercer's hand into the ground until the fight left it. Boone and the others burst through the front just as part of the roof groaned overhead. "Out!" Boone shouted. Caleb grabbed the packet with one hand and Eliza with the other. This time she did not refuse his grip. They stumbled into the night as the fire took the inner wall. One gunman was dragged clear, half-conscious. The other crawled and collapsed in mud. Mercer came out under Boone's rifle and the hands of 3 town men who had discovered, a little late but not too late, that backbone sometimes arrives after the first shot rather than before it. Rain began again then, not hard, just enough to hiss against the flames and turn the yard to steam. The sheriff arrived last, of course, coat half-buttoned and courage suddenly visible once the danger had been tackled by others. But the town had already seen enough. They had seen who had threatened them, who had burned for papers rather than life, who had stood and who had tried to use a woman as bait. They had also seen Caleb bleeding through his shirt while keeping one arm around Eliza because his body, at last, had remembered what his silence had forgotten. At Boone's livery, while the sheriff locked Mercer and the surviving men in the grain room under armed watch, Caleb laid the packet open on a table. The ledger pages looked uglier in lamplight. Boone read. Then the sheriff, then 2 elders from church, then Martin Cole from the store, names they knew, parcels they remembered changing hands under bad circumstances. A widow forced off a claim. A rancher dead after refusing a sale. Money routed through men who smiled in public and hired wolves in private. Truth moved around the room like something alive and unwelcome. "This goes to the territorial judge in Carson," the sheriff said at last, a little too eager to sound righteous now. Caleb met his eyes. "Not that one, he's in it." That landed hard. The sheriff looked back down. Boone muttered, "Then we send copies east and west both." Everywhere they can't burn it all at once. Caleb nodded. That finally sounded like a future larger than one man carrying guilt in a saddlebag. Eliza sat nearby while Mrs. Boone cleaned the raw skin on her wrists. She had not spoken much since the fire. Caleb could feel her silence and knew better now than to fill it for her. At last, when the room had thinned and the papers were being copied by careful hands, she looked at him across the lamplight. "You told the truth tonight." He held her gaze, not all of it, but enough to stop hiding behind the good parts. She absorbed that. That matters. It was not forgiveness. It was something more difficult because it required living people rather than memories. Outside, the rain weakened. By dawn, a pale break appeared in the eastern clouds, and for the first time since Caleb rode back, sunlight touched the town in narrow gold strips along the roofs. The burned shell of the feed shed still smoked at the edge of the pasture. Mercer sat bound for transport, split-lipped and glaring, but diminished now that the thing he served had been named aloud. People moved through the street differently, not as if all wrong had been righted. That is not how towns heal, but the air had changed. When they looked at Eliza, it was no longer with the old pity sharpened into gossip. They had seen her stand in the center of danger and choose action over fear. When they looked at Caleb, it was not with easy welcome. It was more sober than that. They had seen what he defended, and they had heard what he confessed. A man may return broken and still be judged useful. He may even be judged honest, if the honesty costs him enough. Near midday, Caleb stepped out of the livery with his coat folded over one arm and found Eliza unlocking her shop. The sun caught in the wet boards and turned the street almost gentle. She looked tired, so did he. That seemed fitting. He stopped a few paces away. "I'll be leaving after the copies are sent." Eliza set her key down slowly. "You think that's what this requires?" He considered the question carefully, because at last he meant not to answer by instinct or guilt alone. "I think leaving is the habit that made a ruin of things." A small shift crossed her face, not softness, consideration. "Then don't speak to me like a man halfway on a horse." Caleb nodded once. "Fair." The silence that followed was not empty. It held smoke, years, confession, weather, the memory of a promise broken twice and tested a third time under fire. Eliza stepped onto the threshold of her shop and looked at him in full morning light. "I am not the girl who waited by the road." "I know. And you are not going to earn your way back with one night's bravery." "I know that too." She studied him another long moment, as if deciding whether truth had finally settled deep enough in him to hold. "Good," she said, "because what comes next is slower than that." Caleb let out a breath he had not realized he was holding, not relief, something steadier, something that resembled standing on solid ground after years of mud. Eliza opened the shop door. "If you mean to stay," she said, "stay where I can see you, speak when the truth is ugly, and never again decide my life for me from a distance." Caleb felt the full weight and grace of that, not pardon, terms, honest ones. The kind two scarred people might build on if they were willing to stop romanticizing silence and start carrying what was real. "All right," he said. She gave the faintest nod and disappeared inside to begin her work. Caleb remained in the sun a moment longer, listening to the town wake around him, not as a ghost returned, not as a promise restored to what it had been, but as a man finally stripped of the luxury of hiding. The rain had broken. The street would dry. The feed shed would have to be rebuilt. The papers would travel. Names would be answered for. And between him and Eliza, there would be no miracle, no clean erasing of years. Only something harder and, because of that, truer. A chance to rebuild with both eyes open. A chance to come back not once in word, nor once in secret, but each day he remained when remaining cost him pride, comfort, and the old refuge of silence. He turned then and walked toward the livery to help Boone hitch the wagon that would carry the copies out. Behind him, the bell above Eliza's shop door gave a small clear sound in the morning air, and for the first time since riding into town, Caleb did not hear it as judgment. He heard it as the beginning of something earned. If this story stayed with you, ride with us again. Subscribe and help keep these frontier tales alive for the next Firelit Night. Because out here, every name has a past, every trail has a cost, and every sunset still remembers. Until next time, friend, keep your hat tipped to the past and your heart pointed west.